The dust cloud rose behind her stolen mare as Sarah Osborne pushed the animal harder than she ever should have, knowing with a certainty that settled like lead in her chest that this was where her story ended. She had been riding for 3 days straight through Colorado territory in the spring of 1878, fleeing men who wanted her dead for witnessing something she should never have seen. And now the horse was stumbling beneath her, foam flecking its mouth, and she could hear the thunder of hooves gaining ground behind her. When the mare finally gave out completely on the rocky trail leading into the mountains above St. Elmo, Sarah tumbled hard into the dirt, tasting blood and defeat, and simply lay there staring at the impossibly blue sky above, too exhausted to even pray anymore. The riders would be on her in minutes. She had seen them gun down the circuit judge in cold blood back in Leadville, had heard them laugh about it afterward in the saloon, where she had been serving drinks to keep herself fed. They had spotted her frozen face in the doorway, and she had run, but there was nowhere to run to anymore. Her parents were long dead, buried back in Missouri. She had no siblings, no husband, no friends in this unforgiving territory who would risk their necks for a nobody like her. Sarah closed her eyes and waited for the end. "Get up." The voice cut through her resignation like a knife through butter. Sarah's eyes snapped open to see a man standing over her, backlit by the afternoon sun, so she could not make out his features clearly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the practical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a hat that had seen better days pulled low over his face. "I cannot," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I have nothing left." "Then I will have to have enough for both of us," the cowboy said, and there was something in his tone that made her believe him despite everything. He crouched down beside her, and she could finally see his face. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 25 or 26 to her own 22 years, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was a quiet strength in those eyes that made her heart skip despite her terror. "My name is Thomas Quinn. Those men chasing you are the Farrell gang, and they have been terrorizing these mountains for 6 months. I have been tracking them, and I figure you must have a good reason for them wanting you dead." "I saw them murder Judge Harrison," Sarah gasped out, "in Leadville 4 days ago." "I am the only witness." Thomas nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Then we need to get you somewhere safe, and we need to get you there now." He glanced back down the trail where the dust cloud was growing closer. "Can you stand?" "I do not know," Sarah admitted, hating how weak she sounded. "Let me help you find out," Thomas said, and his hand was gentle but firm as he pulled her to her feet. Her legs shook violently, but he steadied her with an arm around her waist that felt as solid as mountain stone. "My horse is just beyond those rocks. We are going to move fast and quiet. Trust me." Sarah wanted to tell him that she had no reason to trust anyone, that every person she had ever relied on had either died or disappeared, but something in his steady gaze stopped her. Instead, she just nodded. They moved together through the scattered boulders, Thomas supporting most of her weight without complaint. His horse, a magnificent buckskin gelding, waited patiently where he had ground tied it. The animal was clearly well trained and well cared for, and Sarah found herself thinking oddly that you could tell a lot about a man by how he treated his horse. "Up you go," Thomas said, lifting her into the saddle with surprising ease before swinging up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, and Sarah found herself pressed back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her spine. It should have frightened her, being this close to a stranger, but instead she felt safer than she had in days. Thomas did not send the horse flying down the obvious trail as Sarah had expected. Instead, He guided the buckskin into what looked like solid rock face, until they were suddenly inside a narrow crevice that opened into a hidden path. The sounds of the feral gang's horses pounded past their hiding spot, the men cursing and shouting as they lost the trail. "There is an old mining camp about an hour from here," Thomas said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "It was abandoned 2 years ago when the silver vein ran out. Nobody goes there anymore. We can rest there, figure out our next move." "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked, the question that had been burning in her mind finally making it to her lips. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Thomas was quiet for a long moment as he navigated the treacherous mountain path with the ease of someone who knew this country like the back of his hand. "My sister was killed 3 years ago by men like the Farrells," he finally said, his voice rough with old grief. "She saw something she should not have seen, too. Nobody would help her. Nobody would stand up to them. By the time I got back from a cattle drive up north, she was dead and buried, and the men who did it were long gone. I swore I would never let that happen to another woman if I could prevent it." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his voice. "I am sorry," she whispered. "So am I," Thomas said, "but sorry does not change what happened. Action does. So we are going to keep you alive, Sarah Osborne, and we are going to make sure those men answer for what they did." The mining camp appeared through the trees like a ghost town, which Sarah supposed it was. Rough wooden buildings sagged against each other, their windows empty and dark. Thomas guided his horse to what had once been the assayer's office, the most solid-looking structure remaining. He dismounted first, then helped Sarah down, catching her when her legs buckled again. "When did you last eat?" he asked, frowning. 2 days ago, maybe 3, Sarah admitted. "I was afraid to stop." Thomas muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse and guided her inside the building. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight that came through the gaps in the walls, but the structure was sound enough. There was even an old potbelly stove in the corner, rusty but functional. "Sit," Thomas ordered, pointing to a surprisingly intact wooden chair. While Sarah collapsed gratefully into it, he moved with efficient purpose, pulling supplies from his saddlebags. Within minutes, he had a fire going in the stove and coffee brewing in a battered tin pot. He produced hardtack, jerky, and a precious can of peaches that he opened with his knife. "Eat slowly," he advised, handing her the food. "Your stomach will rebel if you rush it." Sarah tried to follow his advice, but the first taste of food after days of nothing made her ravenous. She forced herself to take small bites, watching Thomas as he moved around the small space, checking the integrity of the walls and windows, always alert. He moved like a mountain cat, she thought, all controlled power and awareness. "Tell me everything," Thomas said finally, settling onto a crate across from her with his own cup of coffee. "From the beginning," so Sarah told him. She told him about arriving in Leadville 6 months ago with the last of her money. Desperate for work after the farm in Missouri had been foreclosed. She told him about the job at the Silver Dollar Saloon, how the owner had leered at her but paid on time so she had stayed. She told him about the night 4 days ago when she had been bringing a tray of drinks into the back room and had frozen in the doorway at the sight of Judge Harrison on his knees, blood already soaking his white shirt, while 3 men stood over him with smoking guns. The one in charge was named Cole Farrell, Sarah said, her voice shaking at the memory. "I had seen him before. Everyone knew to stay clear of him and his brothers. The judge had been investigating them for claim jumping and murder. I heard Cole say that is what happens to men who forget where their loyalties lie. Then one of the brothers looked up and saw me." "And you ran," Thomas said. "I ran," Sarah confirmed. "I grabbed whatever I could carry, stole a horse from behind the saloon, and I just rode." I thought maybe if I could get to Denver, find a marshal, someone who could help. But they were always behind me, always hunting. The horse I took was not strong enough for the chase. And now here I am, with nowhere left to go." Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, those storm-gray eyes locked on hers. "You are not lost, Sarah. Not while I am here. I have been tracking the Farrells since they murdered a rancher and his son outside of Fairplay last month. I have been gathering evidence, building a case. Your testimony could be the thing that finally brings them down, but we need to keep you alive long enough to testify." "How?" Sarah asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "They will not stop hunting me. They have too much to lose." "Then we make them lose it," Thomas said with quiet conviction. "There is a federal marshal I trust in Colorado Springs. His name is Edward Carver, and he is one of the few lawmen in this territory who cannot be bought. If we can get you to him, get your statement on record, he can bring in federal deputies to hunt the Farrells down. But it is a 4-day ride from here, through some rough country." "4 days," Sarah repeated, the exhaustion threatening to pull her under like a riptide. "I do not know if I can stay ahead of them for 4 more days." Thomas reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of rope and reins, but his grip was gentle. "I've got enough hope for us both," he said, and the certainty in his voice made her want to believe him. "You just need to hold on and trust me. Can you do that?" Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something there that she had not seen in anyone's face in longer than she could remember. She saw someone who genuinely cared whether she lived or died, someone who would stand between her and the darkness. It terrified her and comforted her in equal measure. "Yes," she whispered, "I can do that." They rested for 3 hours while the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Thomas insisted that Sarah sleep while he kept watch, and though she protested that she was too frightened to close her eyes, exhaustion claimed her the moment she lay down on the bedroll he spread for her. She dreamed of gunfire and blood, but also of strong arms and storm-gray eyes that promised safety. When Thomas shook her awake, it was full dark outside. "We move better at night," he explained softly. "The Farrells will not expect us to travel in darkness, and I know these mountains well enough to navigate by starlight." They rode through the night with Sarah, once again held securely in front of Thomas on his horse. He talked to her quietly as they traveled, telling her about growing up on a ranch outside of Pueblo, about learning to work cattle from his father before the older man died of pneumonia. He told her about his sister Margaret, how she had been fierce and funny, and had wanted to be a teacher. He told her about the years he had spent drifting after her death, unable to settle, driven by a need to make the world a little less dangerous for the people who could not protect themselves. Sarah found herself talking too, words spilling out of her that she had kept locked inside for years. She told him about her mother dying when she was 14, about trying to keep the farm going with just her and her father. She told him about watching her father work himself into an early grave trying to keep them afloat, about the bank taking everything the day after they buried him. She told him about the loneliness of the last 2 years, drifting from town to town, always on the outside looking in at other people's lives. "You are not alone anymore," Thomas said when she finally fell silent, and something in the way he said it made her heart stutter in her chest. Dawn found them at the edge of a small valley where a creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Thomas let his horse drink while Sarah knelt at the water's edge and washed the worst of the trail dust from her face and hands. When she looked up, she found Thomas watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You are brave," he said simply, "braver than you give yourself credit for." "I am terrified," Sarah countered. That is what makes it bravery, Thomas said. Being scared and doing what needs doing anyway. He offered her his hand to help her stand. Come on, we should keep moving. I want to make it to Nathrop by nightfall. There is a family there who owes me a favor. They will shelter us. The day passed in a blur of mountain trails and high country meadows. Thomas kept them to the harder paths, the ones that left less trail to follow. Twice he stopped and dismounted, studying the ground with a tracker's eye before nodding in satisfaction and moving on. Sarah had never felt so aware of another person's presence. The way Thomas's body moved with the horse, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warm strength of his arms around her as he held the reins. She was falling for him. The realization hit her somewhere around midday as they stopped to rest the horse near an alpine lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. It was insane, she told herself. She had known him for less than 24 hours. They were running for their lives. This was no time for romance. But her heart did not seem to care about logic. She watched Thomas move through the trees with the effortless grace of someone completely at home in wild places, and she felt something unfurl in her chest that was part longing and part recognition. It was as if some piece of her that had been sleeping had suddenly woken up and declared that this man, this moment, mattered more than anything ever had. "You are staring," Thomas said with a hint of amusement, coming back to where she sat on a fallen log. "I am thinking," Sarah corrected, feeling her cheeks heat. "About what?" Thomas settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Sarah took a breath, deciding that if she was possibly going to die in the next few days, she might as well be honest. "About how strange it is that I feel safer with you, a man I just met yesterday, than I have felt in years with people I had known for months." Thomas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "Maybe that is because I see you, Sarah. Not just a woman who needs protection or a witness to be managed. I see someone who has survived things that would have broken most people, someone who kept running when it would have been easier to give up. I see someone worth knowing." Their eyes met and held. Sarah felt like she could not breathe, like the air had become too thick. Thomas lifted his hand slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and Sarah found herself leaning into the touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "Thomas," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for. "I know," he said, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and questioning. Sarah answered by threading her fingers into his hair and kissing him back with all the pent-up fear and hope and longing that had been building inside her. Thomas made a low sound in his throat and pulled her closer, one hand at the small of her back, the other cupping her face like she was something precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since I first saw you lying in that trail," he admitted roughly. "I know this is fast. I know we have barely met, but Sarah, I feel like I have been waiting my whole life to find you." "I feel it too," Sarah said, relief flooding through her that she was not alone in this madness. "It does not make sense, but I feel it." "The heart does not care much about sense," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But we need to stay focused. I will not lose you to the Farrells. Once you are safe, once this is over, then we can figure out what this is between us." "Deal, deal," Sarah agreed, even though she wanted nothing more than to stay in this moment forever, safe in his arms by this perfect mountain lake. But the world had other plans. As Thomas went to retrieve his horse, Sarah heard the sound that had haunted her dreams for days. The distant crack of a gunshot, followed by a shout that echoed through the valley. The Farrells had found them. Thomas was beside her in an instant, his hand on the gun at his hip. "Get on the horse," he said urgently. Now. They ran for the buckskin, but Thomas's mount was exhausted from carrying double weight through rough terrain for 2 days straight. The horse tried valiantly, but Sarah could feel it laboring beneath them as they crashed through the trees. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. There. Thomas pointed ahead to where the trees opened onto a narrow suspension bridge spanning a deep gorge. The bridge was old, built by miners years ago, wooden planks and ropes swaying in the mountain wind. It looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it too hard. That will never hold all of us, Sarah said, her heart in her throat. It does not have to, Thomas said grimly. You are going across. I am staying on this side to buy you time. No, Sarah twisted in the saddle to look at him. I will not leave you. You have to, Thomas said, and there was anguish in his eyes now. Sarah, someone has to testify against the Farrells. Someone has to make sure they answer for what they have done. That someone is you. They had reached the bridge. Thomas dismounted and pulled Sarah down after him. His hands gripped her shoulders and he looked at her with an intensity that scared her. Listen to me. Follow the trail on the other side, stay high, and it will take you down to Nathrop. The Baker family, look for them. Tell them Thomas Quinn sent you. They will keep you safe and get you to Marshal Carver. Thomas, please, Sarah was crying now, clutching at his shirt. Please do not do this, we can both go. The bridge might hold, we can try. And if it collapses with both of us on it, then the Farrells win and Judge Harrison died for nothing, Thomas said. He pulled her against his chest, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. I need you to live, Sarah. I need you to be safe. That matters more to me than anything. You matter to me, Sarah sobbed against his chest. You said you had enough hope for both of us. I do, Thomas said fiercely, pulling back to look into her eyes. Which is why I know you are going to survive this. You are going to cross that bridge, get to Nathrop, and testify against those bastards. And then you are going to wait for me because I will come for you. I swear to you, Sarah Osborne, I will find you again. He kissed her then, hard and desperate and full of promise. Then he was physically turning her toward the bridge, putting the reins of his horse in her hands. Go, now, while you still have time. Sarah wanted to argue, to fight, to refuse. But the thunder of hooves was so close now, and she understood with terrible clarity that Thomas was right. If they both stayed, they would both die. If she went, at least one of them had a chance. At least the men who killed Judge Harrison would face justice. She grabbed Thomas's face in both hands and kissed him once more. You had better keep your promise, Thomas Quinn, she said fiercely. You had better find me again. Count on it, Thomas said, and then he slapped his horse's rump, sending the animal onto the bridge with Sarah clinging to its back. The buckskin's hooves made the old planks creak and sway alarmingly, but the horse was sure-footed and trusted Sarah's light weight. Sarah looked back once to see Thomas drawing his rifle, taking up a defensive position behind a boulder. Then she forced herself to look forward, to focus on getting across the swaying death trap beneath her. She was halfway across when she heard the first shots ring out. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. The horse sensed her urgency and quickened its pace. More gunfire echoed through the gorge, impossibly loud, and Sarah prayed harder than she ever had that Thomas would be all right. The moment the horse's hooves hit solid ground on the far side, Sarah dismounted and turned back. She could see figures on the other side of the gorge, 3 men confronting Thomas. Even from this distance, she could see he was outnumbered but holding his ground, using the rocks for cover. As she watched, Thomas stepped out from behind the boulder and fired 3 shots in quick succession. One of the figures went down. Then Thomas did something Sarah did not expect. He turned and fired at the bridge itself, the ropes and planks splintering under the impact of his bullets. The ancient structure groaned and began to collapse, sections falling away into the gorge below. The two remaining feral gang members scrambled back from the edge as the bridge disintegrated. Thomas looked across the widening gap, and their eyes met across the distance. He touched his hat in a salute, and Sarah saw him mouth the words, "I will find you." Then he turned and vanished into the trees, leading the ferals away from her trail. Sarah wanted to scream to call him back, but she knew it would be a waste of breath. Thomas had given her a chance to escape, and she could not waste it. Fighting back tears, she climbed back onto the buckskin and turned the horse toward the path Thomas had described. The ride to Nathrop took the rest of the day and most of the night. Sarah stopped only when the horse absolutely needed to rest, driven by the terrible fear that Thomas might already be dead, that she had lost him mere hours after finding him. But she had made him a promise to survive, to testify, and she would keep it even if it killed her. Dawn was breaking over the small mining town of Nathrop when Sarah finally rode down its main street, so exhausted she was swaying in the saddle. She stopped at the general store and asked directions to the Baker family. The storekeeper, a weathered woman with kind eyes, took one look at Sarah's condition and hustled her into a back room, insisting she sit and drink hot coffee before she fell over. "The Bakers live about a mile north of town," the woman said, "but you are in no condition to ride anymore, dear. Let me send my son to fetch them." Sarah wanted to protest that she needed to keep moving, but her body had reached its limit. She nodded gratefully and accepted a blanket the woman wrapped around her shoulders. Within an hour, a couple in their 40s arrived at the store, their faces creased with concern. "You are the one Thomas sent?" the man asked, and Sarah nodded. "I am James Baker, and this is my wife Caroline. Thomas saved our daughter from drowning 2 years back. We owe him more than we could ever repay. You come with us, miss. We will keep you safe." The Baker ranch was modest but well kept, and Caroline Baker fussed over Sarah like a mother hen, feeding her, drawing her a hot bath, and putting her to bed in a cozy room that smelled of lavender. Sarah slept for 14 hours straight, dreamless and deep. When she woke, it was to the smell of frying bacon and fresh bread. She dressed in clean clothes that Caroline had left for her and emerged to find the Baker family at breakfast. They made room for her at the table without fuss, and as Sarah ate the first real meal she'd had in days, James Baker explained their plan. "I sent a rider to Colorado Springs yesterday," he said. "Marshal Carver should be here within 3 days. He is bringing federal deputies with him. Once you give your statement, they will have what they need to issue warrants for the entire feral gang." "What about Thomas?" Sarah asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since she woke. "Has there been any word?" James and Caroline exchanged a look. "No word yet," James said carefully. "But Thomas Quinn is one of the toughest men I know. If anyone can survive an encounter with the ferals, it is him." Sarah wanted to believe that, but as the days passed with no sign of Thomas, her hope began to waver. Marshal Carver arrived right on schedule, a tall man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had seen too much but refused to be hardened by it. Sarah gave him her complete statement, describing in detail what she had seen the night Judge Harrison died. Carver listened intently, asking questions when needed, and by the time they were done, Sarah felt wrung out but also oddly lighter, as if setting the truth down on paper had lifted some of the weight from her shoulders. "You did good, Miss Osborne," Carver said, his weathered face kind. "This is exactly what we need. I am issuing federal warrants for Cole Farrell and his brothers. They will not be free men much longer. But you have to find them first," Sarah said quietly. "We will," Carver promised. "Men like that always make a mistake eventually." And I promise you, justice will be served. Sarah stayed with the Baker family while Carver and his deputies began their hunt. Days turned into a week, then 2 weeks. Sarah helped Caroline with the household chores and gradually began to feel almost human again. The nightmares faded, replaced by dreams of storm-gray eyes and a promise made across a collapsing bridge. She was in the garden pulling weeds on a warm afternoon in early June when she heard the commotion from the front of the house. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat and she ran around the side of the building, her hands still covered in dirt. A rider was dismounting from a tired-looking horse in front of the house. He was dusty and trail-worn, his hat pulled low, but Sarah would have known that silhouette anywhere. She was running before she even consciously decided to move, and then she was in Thomas Quinn's arms and he was holding her so tight she could not breathe and she did not care. "You are alive," she sobbed into his chest. "You are alive, you are here." "I made you a promise," Thomas said roughly, his face buried in her hair. "I said I would find you again." They stood there clinging to each other while James Baker tactfully herded his family back into the house to give them privacy. Finally, Thomas pulled back enough to cup Sarah's face in his hands. He looked thinner than she remembered with new lines around his eyes, but those eyes were as steady as ever. "Tell me," Sarah demanded. "Tell me everything." So Thomas told her. He told her about leading the Farrells on a chase through the mountains for 2 days, always staying just ahead of them. He told her about doubling back to their camp one night and stealing their horses, leaving them on foot. He told her about the confrontation at a box canyon where he had wounded Cole Farrell, but had taken a bullet himself in the process, grazing his ribs. He showed her the bandage still wrapped around his torso under his shirt. "I made my way to a mining camp where an old friend patched me up," Thomas said. "By the time I was fit to ride again, word had reached me that Marshal Carver had federal warrants out for the Farrells and that you were safe with the Bakers. I knew you had kept your promise, so I came to keep mine." "The Farrells?" Sarah asked. "Carver's men caught them 3 days ago trying to flee into New Mexico territory," Thomas said with grim satisfaction. "They are in federal custody now. They will hang for what they did to Judge Harrison and all the others they have killed." Sarah felt something release inside her that she had not even known was still clenched tight. "It is over," she whispered. "It is over," Thomas confirmed. Then he smiled and it transformed his whole face, making him look years younger. "Which means we get to figure out what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" Sarah asked, hardly daring to breathe. "You," Thomas said simply. "I want you, Sarah Osborne. I want to court you properly if you will let me. I want to take you to dances in town and introduce you to my friends and learn everything there is to know about you. I want to build something real with you, something that lasts." "I want that too," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face again, but these were happy tears. "I want all of that." Thomas kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise, and Sarah felt like she was finally, truly home. The courtship that followed was everything Sarah had never dared to dream of. Thomas was attentive and respectful, showing up at the Baker Ranch every day with flowers or little gifts he had carved from wood with his own hands. They went on long rides through the mountains, and Thomas showed her secret places he had discovered over the years. Alpine meadows carpeted with wildflowers and hidden waterfalls that sparkled in the sunlight. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Thomas told her about his dreams of having his own ranch someday, a place where he could raise horses and cattle and build something lasting. Sarah told him about her love of reading, how she had devoured every book she could get her hands on as a girl, and how she still dreamed sometimes of opening a small lending library. "Why not both?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the Baker house watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Why not a ranch with a library? Best of both worlds. Sarah laughed, the sound coming easier now than it had in years. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is simple, Thomas said, taking her hand in his. Maybe we spend too much time looking for complications when the answer is right in front of us. He took a deep breath, and Sarah felt her heart start to race. Marry me, Sarah. I know it has only been 2 months. I know most people would say we are rushing, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Sarah felt like her chest might burst with the force of what she was feeling. Yes, she said, the word coming out almost like a shout. Yes, Thomas Quinn, I will marry you. They were married in August in the small church in Nathrop, with Marshall Carver giving Sarah away and the entire Baker family in attendance. Sarah wore a dress that Caroline had helped her sew, simple but beautiful, and Thomas wore a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortable until Sarah told him he looked handsome, and then his smile chased away any awkwardness. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Thomas kissed her, Sarah felt like every hard moment, every loss and fear and lonely night had been leading her to this, to him, to the life they would build together. Thomas had used the reward money from the Farrell case to make a down payment on 100 acres of good grazing land outside of Buena Vista, about 15 miles north of Nathrop. The property had a small cabin that needed work, but it had good water and mountain views that took Sarah's breath away every morning. They spent the fall of 1878 fixing up the cabin and preparing for winter. Thomas proved to be as handy with a hammer and saw as he was with a rope and rifle, and Sarah discovered she had a knack for making a house feel like a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and braided rag rugs for the floors. Thomas built her shelves for the books she was slowly accumulating, and on cold evenings they would sit by the fire, Sarah reading aloud while Thomas carved or mended tack. Their first winter as man and wife was hard in the way that all mountain winters are hard, with snow piling up higher than the windows and temperatures that could freeze skin in minutes. But inside their cabin, it was warm and bright, and Sarah had never been happier. She learned to cook on the wood stove, burning more than a few meals before she got the hang of it, and Thomas ate everything she made without complaint, even the biscuits that could have doubled as weapons. They made love with the passion of newlyweds and the tenderness of old souls who had found each other against all odds. Thomas was gentle and patient, making sure Sarah felt safe and cherished, and Sarah bloomed under his attention like a flower in spring. By the time the snow melted and green returned to the high country, Sarah knew she was pregnant. She told Thomas one morning in April as he was getting ready to ride out to check on the small herd of cattle he had purchased. He had frozen with one boot half on, staring at her with an expression of such pure joy that Sarah started laughing. "You are serious?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," Sarah confirmed. And then she was in his arms and he was spinning her around the cabin, both of them laughing like children. Their son was born in December of 1879, arriving during a howling blizzard that buried the valley under 3 feet of snow. The midwife from Buena Vista had been staying with them for a week waiting for the birth, and she coached Sarah through the long labor with practiced efficiency while Thomas paced outside in the snow, too nervous to sit still. When the midwife finally opened the door and invited him in, Thomas found Sarah propped up in their bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in the quilt her mother had made years ago. "Thomas, meet your son," Sarah said softly. Thomas approached like he was in a dream, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and staring down at the tiny red face peering out from the quilt. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with tears. "You are perfect." They named him Peter, after Sarah's father. Little Peter was a healthy, loud baby who kept them up nights, but filled their cabin with a joy Sarah had not known existed. She would watch Thomas holding his son, singing old cowboy songs in his rough but gentle voice, and feel so much love she thought her heart might actually burst from it. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. Thomas proved to have a gift for breeding horses, and buyers from as far away as Denver began seeking him out for his animals. Sarah started her lending library, beginning with just 20 books that she kept on a special shelf and lent out to neighbors who stopped by. Word spread, and soon people were coming from surrounding ranches to borrow books and share news. When Peter was 2, Sarah became pregnant again. This time she carried a daughter who arrived in the spring of 1882. An easy birth that had Thomas joking that maybe the girl took after her mother's gentle nature. They named her Margaret, after Thomas's lost sister, and Thomas cried when he held his daughter for the first time, healing something in him that Sarah knew had been broken for a long time. Margaret was followed 2 years later by another son, James, named for James Baker, who had sheltered Sarah when she needed it most. By then, the Quinn Ranch had expanded to 300 acres, and Thomas had built a larger house with a proper room for Sarah's library, which now boasted over 200 volumes. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers. They lost cattle to disease 1 year and had a barn burned down another year. But through it all, Sarah and Thomas faced everything together, their love deepening with each passing season. On their 10th wedding anniversary in August of 1888, Thomas surprised Sarah by taking her back to the spot where they had first kissed, the Alpine Lake, where she had first realized she was falling in love with him. They left the children with the Bakers for the night and rode out together, just the two of them, like they had in the early days. They made camp by the lake as the sun set, and after they had eaten, Thomas pulled Sarah close and they lay together looking up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked quietly. "The way we started, all the fear and running. Do you ever wish you had met me in some normal way, at a dance or a church social?" Sarah propped herself up on one elbow to look down at her husband, this man who had saved her life, and then made that life worth living. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "Every moment, good and bad, brought me to you, and I would live through all of it again if this was where I ended up." Thomas smiled, that smile that still made her heart skip after 10 years, and pulled her down for a kiss. "I've got enough hope for us both," he said, echoing the words he had spoken that first day when she had been ready to give up. "You do," Sarah agreed, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You always have." They stayed at the lake until morning, wrapped in each other's arms, and when they rode home the next day, it was to a house full of laughter and children, and a life that was everything Sarah had never dared to dream possible. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most respected horse operations in central Colorado. Sarah's library grew into a true community resource, with people coming from miles around to borrow books and share stories. Peter grew tall and strong like his father, with a gift for gentling horses that had people saying he could talk to the animals. Margaret inherited her mother's love of books and her father's steady determination, announcing at age 12 that she intended to be a teacher like her Aunt Margaret would have been. Little James was the wild one, always climbing trees and exploring the mountains, keeping his parents on their toes. As the years passed, and Sarah watched her children grow, watched the ranch flourish, and the community around them become a real home, She thought often about that day when she had lain in the trail dust, believing her story was over. She thought about the cowboy who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known to pray, who had looked at her with storm-gray eyes and promised he had enough hope for both of them. Thomas had kept that promise every single day since. He had given her not just hope, but a life full of love and purpose and belonging. He had given her a family, a home, a future she could never have imagined. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved, Sarah would take Thomas's hand and squeeze it gently. No words were needed. They both knew how lucky they were, how easily things could have gone differently. They both understood that what they had built together was precious and rare. The Wild West was a hard place, unforgiving and often cruel. But it was also a place where miracles could happen, where a woman running for her life could find salvation in the form of a cowboy with hope enough for two, and where love could bloom even in the harshest of circumstances. Sarah Osborne Quinn lived to be 83 years old, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in the house Thomas built for her. Thomas passed just 6 months before her, dying peacefully in his sleep after a long and well-lived life. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, under the endless Colorado sky they had both loved so much. And if you visit that spot even now, locals will tell you the story of Sarah and Thomas Quinn, the woman who thought she had lost everything and the cowboy who found her and gave her hope. They will tell you it is a true love story, the kind that only happens in wild places where people have to be tough enough to survive and brave enough to love despite the cost. They will tell you that some promises are worth keeping, no matter what it takes, and that hope, real hope, is powerful enough to change everything. Because in the end, that is exactly what happened. Thomas Quinn had enough hope for them both, and that hope had transformed two broken, lonely people into a family, a legacy, and a love story that would be told for generations to come. Their story became a testament to the power of faith, courage, and the simple belief that tomorrow could be better than today if you were willing to fight for it. The Quinn Ranch still operates to this day, run by descendants who inherited not just the land but the values that built it: hard work, integrity, courage, and above all, hope. And every August, on the anniversary of Sarah and Thomas's wedding, the family makes a pilgrimage to that alpine lake where it all began, where a cowboy and a desperate woman first kissed, and first dared to believe that their story might have a happy ending after all. It did. The happiest of endings, because Thomas Quinn kept his promise. He had enough hope for both of them, and that hope carried them through everything, creating a life that was richer and fuller than either of them had dared to dream possible. They faced hardship and joy, loss and triumph, and through it all they faced it together. Two souls who had found each other in the darkest moment and chosen to build a life in the light. That is the true story of Sarah and Thomas Quinn, the woman who believed all was lost and the cowboy who found her and said the words that changed everything: "I've got enough hope for us both." And because he meant it, because he lived it every single day, their story became exactly what Sarah had needed most: a second chance, a true home, and a love that lasted forever.